The auctioneer had barely finished his opening call when Alberta Crawford dropped to one knee in the dirt and picked up the bay mare's left front hoof, and every man in the packed livestock yard at Harlan's Creek, Texas, fell silent in the August heat of 1882. She was not supposed to be there. That much was clear from the way the other bidders, sun-dried ranchers and trail bosses and sharp-eyed horse traders from as far as San Antonio, had parted around her when she walked in, like creek water splitting around a river stone. She was 26 years old, wearing a practical brown skirt that had seen real work, a cotton blouse the color of old cream, and a hat that had been good once and was still serviceable, and she carried herself with the particular straightness of a person who had learned that confidence was either free or very expensive, and had decided to make it free. The bay mare was the fourth animal in the lot that afternoon. Before Alberta had knelt to check the hoof, she had run her palm along the animal's cannon bone, pressed 2 fingers against the fetlock joint with a knowledge that was quiet and sure, and looked into the horse's left eye for a long moment as though they were exchanging something private. Only then did she kneel, lift the hoof, scrape it clean with the small tool she carried in her coat pocket, and examine the frog and wall with the focused attention of a person who understood that the difference between a sound horse and a ruined one lived in those inches of horn and flesh. Ezekiel Dunlap saw all of this from the fence rail where he had been sitting for the better part of an hour, watching the sale with the half-lidded patience of a man who was in no particular hurry, but was paying attention to everything. He was 31, lean without being thin, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of face that had been weathered enough to look honest. He owned the Dunlap spread 6 miles north of Harlan's Creek, 460 acres of decent grass and 1 good well, and a reputation for running the cleanest horse operation in Caldwell County. He had come to the sale today looking for a second stud prospect. He had not come looking for anything else. And yet, he watched Alberta Crawford set that hoof down gently, stand up, dust her knee off with one practical swipe, and then and only then raise her hand at precisely the right moment. He leaned over to the man standing beside him, a weathered cattle broker named Horace Tibbs who knew everyone in 4 counties. "Horace," Ezekiel said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended, "I need to know her name." Horace squinted at him, then looked at Alberta, then looked back at Ezekiel with the expression of a man filing something away for later use. "That is Alberta Crawford," he said. "Widow. Runs the Crawford place up on the Salado Fork, about 9 miles northeast. Her husband Thomas Crawford passed 2 winters ago. Fever took him." Ezekiel said nothing. He watched Alberta complete the bid, watched her shake hands with the auctioneer's assistant, watched her lead the bay mare to the hitching post with the ease of someone who had been handling horses before she could properly reach their withers. She did not look in his direction. She was entirely focused on the animal, checking the lead rope, speaking quietly to the mare's neck, and he was struck by the complete sufficiency of her attention, the way she was entirely present in what she was doing and entirely unconcerned with being observed. He climbed down off the fence rail. He told himself he was going to look at the next lot, a pair of 2-year-old geldings that had been trail-worked through the Edwards Plateau and reportedly had good feet and better temperaments. He walked in that direction. He got about halfway there before his boots changed course entirely of their own apparent accord, and he found himself approaching the hitching post where Alberta Crawford was checking the bay mare's girth strap on her own riding horse, a compact gray with a kind eye, before she loaded the new acquisition. "Excuse me," he said. She turned. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of a river in early spring, and they assessed him with a directness that was not unfriendly but was not particularly soft either. "Ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "My name is Ezekiel Dunlap. I run the Dunlap spread north of town. I wanted to say that was a thorough inspection you ran on that mare." Alberta looked at him for a moment. "It needed to be thorough," she said. "The animal was favoring her right side when they brought her in." Most people did not see it because she corrects it after the first few steps, but it is there. I wanted to know whether it was a hoof issue or something higher in the leg. She paused. It was the hoof. Easy enough to address. He stood there for just a moment longer than made immediate practical sense. You know horses, he said. I do, she said. It was not boastful, it was simply accurate. I raise them, he said. She tilted her head very slightly. I know who you are, Mr. Dunlap. You brought 2/4 horse crosses through here in the spring. Beautifully built animals. Their hocks were a little straight for my preference, but their wind was exceptional. She said it calmly, as though discussing the weather, and then she turned back to the gray's girth strap. He felt something shift in his chest, some tightening and loosening at the same time that he had no good word for. You saw those horses. I see all the good horses that come through here, she said simply. He tried to find something intelligent to say. May I ask how you learned to assess feet the way you do? She glanced at him again, and this time there was the faintest suggestion of something warmer behind the directness. My father, she said. He was a farrier in Missouri before we came west. He taught me before he taught my brothers because he said I had better hands and more patience. She secured the girth strap and straightened. It has served me well. I imagine it has, Ezekiel said. There was a pause. The sounds of the sale yard filled the space between them, the auctioneer's call, the stomp of hooves, the low talk of men, and the occasional protest of livestock being moved. Well, Alberta said, and gathered the bay mare's lead rope. I have a 9-mile ride home, Mr. Dunlap, and I would like to start before the heat gets any worse. Of course, he said, stepping back. It was a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Crawford. She had one foot in the stirrup and she paused, looking back at him over her shoulder. You as well, she said, and swung up into the saddle with the practiced economy of someone who rode every day and never thought twice about it. He stood and watched her ride out through the gate, leading the bay mare, and then he stood there for a few more seconds after she was out of sight, and Horace Tibbs materialized at his elbow like a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. You going to bid on those geldings or not? Horace asked. Yes, Ezekiel said, and meant it, but his mind was on gray-green eyes and the sure, quiet way a woman had pressed 2 fingers against a fetlock and known things. He bought one of the geldings. He drove home with the animal tied to the back of the wagon, and the whole 9 miles he was thinking about 9 miles in the other direction, and whether that constituted a reasonable distance for a neighborly call. He decided it did. He waited 4 days, because he did not want to appear precipitous, and because he had real work to do, a fence line along the east pasture that had been threatening to fail since the spring rains, a delivery of hay from the Mercer farm to coordinate, and a conversation with his hired man, a steady Mexican vaquero named Rosario Fuentes, who had worked the Dunlap spread for 3 years and kept things running with quiet competence. Rosario asked no questions about the gelding's origin and several questions about the fence line, and Ezekiel was grateful for both. On the 5th morning, he saddled the gray gelding he called Cinder, not the new one, his own reliable animal, and rode northeast along the Salado Fork. The Crawford place came into view around a bend in the creek, and he reined Cinder in for a moment to look at it. It was a modest operation, a stone house built for permanence, a good-sized barn in better repair than many he had seen, 3 separate pastures fenced with the careful attention of someone who understood that good fencing saved you from bad situations. There were horses in 2 of the pastures. He counted 7 from where he sat, and even at this distance he could see they were well-conditioned, well-fed, moving with the easy confidence of animals that were handled properly. And there in the near pasture was the bay mare from the sale. She was standing still while Alberta Crawford worked on her hoof from a crouched position, a rasp in her hand, working with the focused patience of someone who had done this 100 times. Ezekiel opened the gate and rode in. Alberta heard him coming and looked up without alarm, which told him she had probably heard him before she looked. She set the rasp down on a wooden box beside her, straightened and waited while he brought Cinder to a stop at a respectful distance. Mr. Dunlap, she said, It was not unfriendly, it was careful. "Mrs. Crawford," he said. He took his hat off because he was on a person's property and it was the right thing to do. "I hope I am not intruding. I was in the area and wanted to see how the mare was settling." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and he had the clear sense that she was deciding something. "You were not in this area for any reason I can imagine," she said. "Unless you specifically came here. Your spread is north. This is northeast. They are not the same direction." He felt color rise in his face, which surprised him because he was not, generally speaking, a man who blushed easily. "You are right," he said. "I came specifically. I apologize if that is an imposition." The careful look softened very slightly at the edges. "It is not an imposition," she said. "It is just unusual. Most men who want to pay a call find some excuse that sounds more accidental." She tilted her head toward the mare. "She is doing well." The wall was cracked at the bottom and there was some thrush that had been going unaddressed. Whoever had her before did not know what they were doing. "You knew at the sale," he said. "I suspected," she said. "That is why I checked." He dismounted and let Cinder stand on a loose rein, which the horse was well trained enough to do. He walked to the fence so they could speak without having to raise their voices. "How many horses are you running here?" he asked. "7 right now, plus the bay makes 8, she said. "I have a buyer in Lockhart who takes 3 or 4 a year if they are properly trained. The rest I sell locally or keep for the ranch work." She looked at him with that same direct assessment. "It is a small operation." "It is a tight one," he said, and meant it as a compliment. Something in her posture changed, some small release of tension he had not known was there. "That is a kind way to put it," she said. "I have had people suggest that a woman alone cannot run a horse operation effectively." "Those people are wrong," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly, "they are." They talked for another 20 minutes, standing at that fence in the warm August morning, the creek running softly behind the pasture and the horses moving in the grass. She asked about his operation and he told her honestly, the breeding program, the grass management, the challenges of the dry spell the previous summer, and what it had done to the hay supply. She listened the way some people read, with total absorption, and when she asked questions they were specific and good, and he found himself answering them more completely than he usually answered anyone because she clearly understood the answers. When he finally took his leave, she walked him to the gate, which was a courtesy, and as he mounted she looked up at him with those gray-green eyes and said, "You are welcome here, Mr. Dunlap, if you have occasion to come this way again." "I expect I will find occasion," he said, and she smiled then, just briefly, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it was like a door opening in a dark room. He rode home thinking about that smile for the full 9 miles. He told Rosario he thought the east pasture fence was in better shape than he had estimated. Rosario gave him a look that suggested he knew perfectly well that Ezekiel had not been looking at fences that morning, but said only that he was glad to hear it. The weeks that followed had a particular rhythm that Ezekiel came to look forward to with an intensity he tried to keep in proportion and mostly failed. He found reason to ride northeast every 4 or 5 days. Sometimes he brought things, a cutting of a grass variety he thought might do well on her south pasture, a recommendation for a farrier's rasp that was better than the common ones, once a length of good leather that he had ordered extra by apparent accident. She never seemed to find these visits unwelcome. She met him at the gate or in the barn or in the pasture where she was working, and they talked with the comfortable depth of 2 people who spoke the same language and kept finding more things to say in it. He learned things about her. She had grown up in Missouri, moved to Texas at 16 with her family. She had married Thomas Crawford at 21, a good man by her account, steady and decent, who had died of a fever 2 years ago and left her the ranch and a mortgage and a grief she had worked her way through methodically, the way she worked through everything. She had no children. She had made peace with that. She had a sister in San Antonio who wrote letters that arrived 2 weeks after everything they described had already happened. She learned things about him. He had been born in Tennessee. came west at 19 with nothing much to recommend him except a willingness to work and a genuine feeling for horses. He had bought the Dunlap spread 7 years ago from a man who was moving to California and had taken what looked like a marginal property and turned it into something worth having through sheer patient attention. He had never been married. He had come close once, a woman named Clara Holt in San Antonio, but she had ultimately chosen a banker with a townhouse and indoor plumbing, and he had found he understood her reasoning even while it hurt. He said this to Alberta one evening when they were sitting on her porch after supper, because somewhere in the third week he had started staying for supper sometimes when invited, which she began offering with a casualness that felt deliberate, and she had looked at him with a softness that she did not often show. "Did it hurt for long?" she asked. "Long enough," he said. "Not as long as I expected." "Grief is strange that way," she said. "Sometimes it is shorter than the love that preceded it. Sometimes it is much longer. With Thomas, I think I was grieving for a long time before he died. He was ill for almost a year. By the time he passed, some of the acute part was already spent." She paused. "That sounds cold." "It does not sound cold at all," he said quietly. She looked at him and then looked away at the darkening pasture where the horses were settling for the night, and there was a long, comfortable silence that was not uncomfortable at all. It was Rosario who said it first, with the directness of a man who had no patience for people tiptoeing around obvious things. On a Wednesday morning in late September, while they were sorting fence posts in the equipment shed, he said without looking up from his work, "You should tell that woman you have feelings for her, Ezekiel. You are wearing a groove in the road between here and there." Ezekiel opened his mouth to say something evasive and then closed it. "I do not want to presume," he said. Rosario looked at him. "She invites you to supper," he said. "She asks your opinion on her pasture management. She told Horace Tibbs's wife that you are the most sensible horseman in Caldwell County. In this part of the world, that is a declaration." Ezekiel picked up a fence post and said nothing. "Tell her," Rosario said, and went back to work. He thought about it for another week, which was probably 6 days longer than it needed to take. What held him back was not lack of feeling. The feeling was there with a fullness that surprised him. A man who had considered himself past the age of being caught off guard by his own heart. What held him back was something more careful. Alberta Crawford had built something here on her own, in the 2 years since her husband died, and she had built it with intention and pride. And he did not want to come in with anything that might look like he was trying to incorporate what was hers into what was his. He wanted to find the right words for what he was actually offering, which was something different. He found the words on a Thursday morning in early October when he rode up to find her in the middle of a situation. There was a man in her yard he did not know, heavyset and red-faced, sitting a horse that was too good for him, and he was talking to Alberta in a tone that was too loud and too close. Ezekiel heard the conversation from the gate as he came through. "Reasonable offer, Mrs. Crawford, and you will not see better. The bank holds the note on this property, and I have spoken with Hendricks personally." "Mr. Garfield," Alberta said, and her voice was steady as iron, "you have come here 3 times in 2 months, and 3 times I have told you this property is not for sale. I will tell you a 4th time clearly. This property is not for sale. I am current on my mortgage payments, which you would know if you had spoken to Hendricks honestly, and you have no business here." Garfield Ezekiel now put a name to him, Franklin Garfield, who ran a cattle operation 12 miles south and was known for expanding it by the most convenient means available, turned his horse in a tight, irritable circle. "Sentiment is a luxury, Mrs. Crawford, and a woman alone." "She is not alone," Ezekiel said. He had not planned to say it. It came out of him the way true things sometimes did, without much ceremony. He rode Cinder up to stand beside Alberta and looked at Garfield with the kind of steadiness that was neither aggressive nor apologetic. Garfield looked at him, assessed him, and made some private calculation. "Dunlap," he said, as a form of acknowledgement. "Garfield," Ezekiel said. "Just having a business discussion," Garfield said. "The discussion appears to be concluded," Ezekiel said pleasantly. "Mrs. Crawford has given you her answer." Garfield looked between them, set his jaw, and turned his horse and rode out through the gate without another word. Ezekiel watched him go until he was well down the road, and then he turned to Alberta. She was looking at him with an expression he could not immediately read, and for one sharp moment he was afraid he had overstepped. He opened his mouth to say he was sorry if he had interfered, that he knew she was perfectly capable of handling it herself. "Thank you," she said before he could speak. "He has been coming around," he said. "It was not a question." "3 times," she confirmed. "He wants the land. He claims the bank is willing to call the note, but that is not true. I checked with Hendricks directly. Garfield is bluffing." She paused. "But the visits are unpleasant." "If he comes again," Ezekiel said, "you send word to me." She looked at him for a long moment. The October air was moving her hair very slightly where it escaped her hat, and the morning light was doing something particular to her face, finding the angles of it and the steadiness in her eyes, and he made a decision. "Alberta," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and it came out more carefully than he intended, like something handled gently. She looked at him. Something in her went very still, the way animals went still when they were paying close attention to something important. "I have something to say to you," he said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think plain is what you prefer." "It is," she said quietly. He took a breath. "I am not a man who is good at elegant speeches. What I can tell you is what is true. I have spent 2 months riding 9 miles each way to have conversations with you that are the best part of my week. I think you are remarkable, and I think you are the most genuinely capable person I have met in Texas. I am not here to offer you anything that would diminish what you have built. I would like to know if you would consider allowing me to court you properly, with the possibility of a future together that keeps what is yours as yours and brings mine alongside it, not over it." The silence that followed lasted long enough that he was aware of every second of it. Then Alberta Crawford, who was not a woman given to impulsive things, stepped forward and put her hand on his forearm where it rested on the saddle horn and looked up at him and said, "I was wondering when you were going to say that." He laughed. It came out of him sudden and genuine and somewhat relieved, and she smiled at him, not the brief smile from the first day but a full and open one that changed her whole face, and he thought he had never seen anything better in his life. "I will consider it," she said. "I have already been considering it if I am honest, but yes, Ezekiel, you may court me." He was off Cinder and standing on the ground before he had entirely decided to dismount, and she looked up at him at close range with those gray-green eyes, and he took her hand in both of his, and she let him. The formal courtship, as they both understood it, was somewhat performative, because the thing it was meant to establish had been growing between them for 2 months already with considerable momentum. Still, they observed it. He called on her in the proper way. He took her to church in Harlan's Creek on Sundays when the roads permitted, which created a quantity of interested local observation that neither of them found particularly distressing. He met her sister Elspeth, who came up from San Antonio in November for a week, and who was brighter and louder than Alberta but clearly loved her, and who interrogated Ezekiel over supper on the first evening with a thoroughness he had last encountered from a circuit judge. "You are not going to try to take her operation away from her," Elspeth said, with the bluntness of a woman who had decided that politeness was a less efficient tool. "No," Ezekiel said. "You understand that she has been running this place successfully for 2 years without assistance. I am aware of that and I regard it with considerable admiration," he said. "You are not condescending about horses," Elspeth said, as though this were a specific concern. "I would not dare to be," he said honestly. "She knows more about feet and soundness than I do." Elspeth looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at Alberta, and something passed between the sisters that he did not have the vocabulary for, and Elspeth picked up her fork and said, "He seems tolerable, Alberta," which Alberta told him afterward was among the highest endorsements her sister gave. Franklin Garfield came back once more in November, and this time Ezekiel was there. Not because he had been watching or patrolling. He happened to be there because he was there most days now, for some part of them. And Garfield arrived in the late afternoon to find Ezekiel in the barn helping Alberta work through the bay mare's continued hoof treatment, which was progressing well. Garfield stood at the barn door and looked at the two of them, and at Cinder tied at the post outside. And whatever he had come to say died somewhere between his brain and his mouth, and he took himself off without a word. He did not come back after that. There was also the matter of the mortgage, which Alberta told him about in November with a directness that he understood was trust. She was 2 years into a 5-year note with the Harlan's Creek Bank, the payments manageable but not comfortable, dependent on the horse sales continuing to perform well, and on nothing going catastrophically wrong with the weather or the animals. She had been managing it precisely, month to month, with no margin for error. "I am not telling you this because I am looking for rescue," she said clearly, sitting across from him at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee between her hands. "I am telling you because if this is to become a serious thing, you should know the shape of it, all of it." "I appreciate that," he said. "What would help?" She looked at him steadily. "A buyer for the mare," she said. "I have had interest from a man in Austin who works with a racing establishment. She is fast and she is sound now, but I need someone with good contacts in Austin and I do not have them myself." "I have a contact in Austin," he said. "A man named Breckenridge who deals in quality animals. He would know who to talk to." She nodded. "That would help." He wrote to Breckenridge that evening. Breckenridge responded within 2 weeks with an introduction to a gentleman's racing concern that ultimately purchased the bay mare in December for a price that was significantly better than the local market, and brought Alberta's mortgage into a much more comfortable position. She told him this with the kind of satisfaction that was not just financial, but had something deeper in it, the satisfaction of a plan working, of a calculation coming right. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that acknowledged both the practical thing and the nature of the partnership it represented. "That was your horse and your work," he said. "I only opened a door." "The right door at the right time matters," she said. December in the hill country was mild compared to what either of them had known in their first homes farther north, but there were cold nights, and on those nights Ezekiel had taken to staying later at the Crawford place than was strictly necessary, sitting by the fire and talking in the particular way that deep winter evenings in isolated places invite, the talk that goes past the surface of things and finds the country underneath. He learned that she read voraciously, that she had an opinion on everything from grass varieties to the territorial question in the New Mexico country, and was not shy about expressing them. He learned that she was funny in a dry, quiet way that rewarded attention. He learned that she was not afraid of silence, which was something he valued enormously, having known people who used words as a way of keeping silence at bay and found the habit exhausting. She learned that he had a streak of stubbornness that he himself did not always recognize as stubbornness. He called it principle, and sometimes it was, but sometimes it was just him wanting things his way, and she told him so in December with a directness he found initially startling and then genuinely appreciated. She also learned that he was patient in the way that certain people are patient, not because things did not move him, but because he had learned over time that rushing good things was its own kind of damage. On a Thursday in late December, with a blue norther having rolled down from the panhandle, and the temperature outside the Crawford house window significantly below what either of them had anticipated that morning, Ezekiel stayed, because the weather made the ride impossible rather than inadvisable, and Alberta made him up the narrow bed in the back room that had been used for storage. And they said good night with a propriety that was sincere. And in the morning she made coffee and there were eggs from her 3 chickens. And they sat across from each other in the gray winter light, and he thought this was the most natural thing that had ever happened to him. "I want to ask you something," he said. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and waited. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I have been thinking about how to say it in a way that honors what you have here and what you have built, and what I have arrived at is this. I would like us to work these two operations together, with both of them kept intact, yours and mine, and to see what they become with both of us tending them. I am not asking you to come work my land. I am asking you to let our two pieces of land be part of the same life." He paused. "I am also asking because I love you. I should say that clearly. I love you, Alberta, and I would like to spend my life with you if you will have me." The room was very quiet. Outside, the norther was moving through the cedar and live oak with a sound like distant water. Alberta Crawford looked at him for a long time. Her gray-green eyes were bright with something that was not tears but was adjacent to them. "Ezekiel," she said quietly, "I love you too. I have for some time. I was waiting to be sure you knew what you were getting into." "I know what I am getting into," he said. "2 mortgages, 8 horses, 1 excellent farrier, and a woman who will tell me when I am being stubborn." She laughed, and it was full and warm, and it filled the kitchen. "Yes," she said, "that is what you are getting into." "Then yes," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ezekiel, yes." He crossed the kitchen and she stood, and he took her face in his hands with a gentleness that was also conviction, and he kissed her in the gray December morning with the norther outside and the horses in the barn, and she kissed him back with a quiet fierceness that told him everything she had been thinking for the last 4 months. They were married in February of 1883 in the small stone church in Harlan's Creek, with Elspeth in from San Antonio again, and Rosario Fuentes standing as Ezekiel's witness in his best shirt, looking extremely respectable and extremely pleased. The preacher, a practical man named Reverend Mills who had married and buried half the county, read the words with the straightforward dignity they deserved. And when he said the part about joining in partnership as well as love, Ezekiel thought that was exactly the right word, and that Reverend Mills had somehow understood the specific nature of what was happening in front of him. Alberta wore a dress that Elspeth had helped her make, a deep blue that did things for her eyes that Ezekiel found quite distracting throughout the ceremony, and she carried a small bunch of cedar and dried winter berries, because flowers were not plentiful in February in Texas. She looked at him when she said her vows with the same direct attention she gave to horses and fence lines, and everything else she considered worth her full presence, and he thought there was no greater thing in the world than being the object of Alberta Crawford's full attention. They rode home to the Crawford place, which would become their primary home, the Dunlap land managed by Rosario with regular oversight from Ezekiel. In the late afternoon light, the hills rolling blue and gold around them, and she rode the gray and he rode Cinder, and they rode side by side with their shoulders almost touching, talking about the spring planting and the 2 horses she thought were ready for serious training, and whether the north pasture fence needed addressing before the spring rains. "We are discussing fence posts," he said, "on our wedding day. You told Horace Tibbs about your east fence on the day we met," she pointed out. "That is fair," he said. "I think," she said, looking over at him with a smile that he now knew was not rare but that still struck him as extraordinary every time, "that talking about the things that matter to you with the person who matters most to you is exactly the right thing to do on any day, including a wedding day." He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they rode the rest of the way home like that. The first spring of their marriage was the kind of spring that rewards all the careful work that preceded it. Alberta's north pasture fence was indeed repaired before the rains, and the rains came in good volume in March and April, filling the creek and bringing up the grass in that particular saturated green that made the hill country look like something from a painting of a different, wetter continent. The horses thrived. 2 of them, a pair of well-trained sorrel mares that Alberta had been working with particular patience through the winter, sold to a stable in Austin for a combined price that cleared a substantial portion of the mortgage. The Dunlap land was running well under Rosario's management, producing the quarter horse crosses that had established its reputation. And in April, a buyer from San Antonio came out to look at the new stud prospects and stayed for 3 days inspecting animals and talking bloodlines. And before he left, he placed an order for 4 horses to be delivered the following spring and told Ezekiel it was the best stock he had seen between here and the nooses. Ezekiel told him that his wife's assessment of hoof and soundness was responsible for the quality of the program, and the man from San Antonio looked at Alberta with a recalibrated respect that she accepted without comment. She was expecting their first child by May, which she told him on a Tuesday morning after breakfast with the same directness she brought to everything, watching his face with those gray-green eyes. He sat down, which he did not entirely intend, and then he stood back up, and she was laughing at him in that warm, dry way she had, and he crossed the kitchen and held her in his arms, and she let herself be held, her hands pressed flat against his back, and he thought his heart might actually not fit inside his chest properly. "Are you well?" he asked against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "Are you happy?" She leaned back and looked up at him. "I am very happy," she said, with a conviction that was quiet and total. The summer of 1883 brought a new complication that neither of them had anticipated. A water rights dispute arose between the Crawford property and the Marchetti farm to the southeast, over access to the Salado Fork during dry periods. The Marchetti family, 3 brothers who had been in the area longer than anyone Alberta knew, claimed the right to divert the creek during summer months, which in a dry year would reduce the Crawford water supply to something problematic. Ezekiel was inclined to handle it legally, through the county recorder's office, which had documents about the original land grants that he believed favored their position. Alberta agreed on the legal approach, but also took the more direct route of going to call on the oldest Marchetti brother, a man named Carlo who was in his 60s, and had always been on reasonable terms with her during Thomas Crawford's time. She rode over to the Marchetti place on a Tuesday with a jar of preserved peaches from her kitchen and a clear head, and she sat with Carlo Marchetti on his porch for 2 hours, and she came home having negotiated a rotation agreement for summer water access that was fair to both properties and required no legal action. She told Ezekiel about it over supper, and he looked at her with the particular admiration that had become one of his habitual expressions where she was concerned. "You brought preserved peaches," he said. "Carlo Marchetti has a sweet tooth," she said simply. "You knew that." "I have been a neighbor to that family for 5 years," she said. "You learn things." She paused. Legal action would have made enemies. This made an agreement. He shook his head slowly. "I am a better rancher for knowing you," he said. "You were an excellent rancher before you knew me," she said. "You are now an excellent rancher with better water access." He laughed, and she served him more of the stew she had made, and the evening settled into that comfortable warmth that had become the texture of their life together, full of practical talk and genuine feeling, and the particular peace of 2 people who were, in the most complete sense, on the same side. The baby came in November of 1883, and he was a boy. They named him James Thomas Dunlap, James for Ezekiel's father, Thomas for the man who had built the property James would one day grow up on, which Alberta proposed and Ezekiel accepted as both a kindness and a rightness. He was born in the stone house on the Salado Fork with a midwife named Mrs. Vargas who had delivered half the children in the county, and who pronounced James Thomas loud and healthy with a briskness that was deeply reassuring. Ezekiel held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom, and the weight and warmth of that small person in his arms produced a feeling he had no prior experience with, something that went through him like water finding its level, settling him in a way that was permanent and total. He looked over at Alberta, who was watching him with exhausted, luminous eyes, and he said quietly, "He has your hands." She looked at James's small curled fingers. "He has your nose," she said. "I am sorry about that," he said. She laughed, softly because she was tired, and reached up and touched his face, and he turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm. The years that followed built themselves with the particular satisfaction of a life that is genuinely well chosen. The horse operation grew, steadily and without drama, gaining a reputation in the region that was based entirely on the quality of the animals and the soundness of their feet. That last part became something of a point of pride, a known characteristic of Crawford Dunlap horses, that they were checked thoroughly before they were sold and arrived at their destination sound. It was Alberta's standard, and it became the operation standard, and buyers came from further distances to find it. Rosario Fuentes, who had managed the Dunlap land through the transition of Ezekiel's marriage, eventually relocated his own household to a small property adjacent to the Dunlap spread, which he purchased with wages carefully saved, and Ezekiel and Alberta attended the celebration of his marriage to a woman named Esperanza who had come up from Coahuila and who turned out to share Rosario's capacity for quiet competence. The two families became the kind of neighbors that were closer than most relations. James grew in the way that children grow in that country, in long expanses of outdoor learning punctuated by periods of intense focused instruction. Alberta taught him horses from the time he could walk beside one. Ezekiel taught him the land and the grass and the weather. Mrs. Vargas had told them that some children born on ranches grew up either loving the land or leaving it as fast as they could, and James showed early signs of being entirely the first kind. He was at home in the pastures and the barn with a comfort that was instinct, and by 4 years old he was following Alberta on her rounds with a small, serious face that was so like hers that Rosario once said the boy was a direct copy, and Ezekiel had married his own household foreman. In the spring of 1885, Alberta became pregnant again. She told Ezekiel over supper in April with the same directness as the first time, and this time he did not sit down accidentally. He came around the table to her, and she stood, and they held each other in the kitchen with the particular warmth of people who had done this before and knew what it meant and were glad. Elspeth came up from San Antonio again for the birth, which was in December, and the second child was a girl. They named her Clara Rose Dunlap. Clara for the clear December air, and Rose because Alberta said she had always wanted to give a daughter a soft name, and she felt entitled to it. She was a different child from James in every observable way from the beginning, louder, more demanding of attention, quicker to express her preferences, and gifted with a smile that she appeared to deploy with conscious strategic intent from approximately the age of 3 months. James, at 2 years old, regarded his sister with the tolerant uncertainty of a person who has encountered something new and has not yet decided what to make of it. By the time Clara Rose was 6 months old and able to respond to him, he had decided what to make of it, which was that she was his responsibility and most interesting thing in his life, and he became her fiercest small protector. Harlan's Creek itself was changing in those years, as Texas was changing, new people coming in, new businesses, a second general store and a telegraph office by 1885, talk of a rail spur that would eventually connect the town to the main line. Alberta watched these changes with the attention she gave everything, noting what was good and what was concerning. She was appointed to the committee that advised on the school in 1885 because she had been attending school board meetings for 2 years and asking better questions than anyone else in the room, and the committee chair, a practical woman named Mrs. Ellen Pryor, had simply told her at the end of a meeting one October that they needed her formally, and she had said yes because she agreed. The school question mattered to her in a personal way she did not always express directly, but that Ezekiel understood. There were children in Harlan's Creek and the surrounding county who had no reliable access to schooling Mexican children from the farming families along the creek, children from poorer homesteads out past the ridge, children whose parents worked and could not always spare them for the walk to town. She pushed for extended school hours, for the hiring of a second teacher who could take a separate group of students, and for the use of school supplies donated rather than only purchased. She argued these things at committee meetings with the same patient, evidence-based directness she used for everything, and she won most of them, though not all and not always quickly. Ezekiel told her one evening that he was proud of her for fighting that fight, and she said she was not fighting. She was simply making the best argument available and presenting it to people who were capable of being persuaded if you gave them facts and time. Not everyone agrees with that approach, he said. They will, she said, eventually, and she turned back to the lesson she was preparing for a Friday afternoon class she had taken to teaching herself, for the children who could not reach the school building but could reach the Crawford Dunlap porch. He sat and watched her write out the lesson plan by lamplight, her hand moving steadily across the paper, her profile composed and focused, and he thought about the livestock sale in 1882, and the woman who had knelt in the dirt to check a horse's hoof before she raised her hand, and the feeling that had moved through him when he watched her. And how if he had not said "I need to know her name" to Horace Tibbs that afternoon he would have gone home without knowing. And the whole shape of his life would have been different, smaller, less. "What are you thinking about?" she asked without looking up from the paper. "The sale at Harlan's Creek," he said. "The day we met." She looked up then. The lamp made the light in her eyes particular and warm. "You were sitting on the fence rail," she said. "You knew I was watching," he said. "Of course I knew," she said. "I knew from the first step I checked." He stared at her. "You never said so." "You never asked," she said, and went back to the lesson plan with the small, pleased expression of a person who has been holding a good card and finally had occasion to play it. He shook his head in the private, wholly affectionate way he had developed for the moments when she surprised him, which were regular enough that he kept the expression well practiced. In the fall of 1886, a drought came down across central Texas that was the worst in memory. The grass went brown and cracked in August and stayed that way through November, and the Salado Fork dropped to a trickle, and then to pools separated by stretches of hot white limestone. The horse market slowed because buyers who could not water their existing stock were not buying new animals, and the hay supply across the county became a negotiated commodity that required careful management. Alberta and Ezekiel had prepared for dry years better than most, partly because Alberta was constitutionally incapable of not planning for bad outcomes, and partly because the water rotation agreement with Carlo Marchetti proved its value enormously during those months, giving them priority access to the creek pools during the worst of it. They reduced their herd to the animals they could support properly, a painful but necessary calculation that Alberta made with the same clear head she brought to everything. And they sold hay surplus from the previous 2 good years at a fair price to neighbors who needed it. The drought broke in December with 3 days of steady rain that refilled the creek and brought a green so vivid it looked unreal after the months of brown. Alberta stood at the pasture fence on the morning after the rain ended and looked at the wet grass and the running creek, and Ezekiel came to stand beside her, and they stood there for a long time without speaking, because there was nothing that needed to be said and everything that needed to be felt. James, who was 3 and had been present for the drought with the total unfazed acceptance that very young children bring to ordinary catastrophe, splashed through a puddle near the barn and fell down and came up muddy and entirely satisfied. And Clara Rose, at 13 months and newly walking, attempted to follow him and required intervention from Ezekiel, who was closest. "She is going to be exactly as difficult as he is," Alberta observed. "Worse," Ezekiel said. "She is already more determined." "I cannot imagine where she gets that from," Alberta said, in the tone she used when she knew perfectly well. By 1887, the mortgage on the Crawford property was fully paid. Alberta told Ezekiel on a Tuesday evening, setting the receipt from the bank on the kitchen table between them with a precision that he understood was ceremonial, and he looked at the document and then at her, and she was not triumphant in any showy way. She was simply, deeply, thoroughly satisfied, The way a person is satisfied when something they have worked toward for a long time arrives at exactly where it was headed. He poured 2 glasses of the good whiskey from the shelf that was saved for significant occasions, and they drank them sitting at the kitchen table, with James asleep in the next room, and Clara Rose making the small sound she made when she was almost but not quite asleep, and the lamplight on the table between them and the paid receipt, and the particular richness of a life that had been built by 2 people who knew what they were doing and had had the sense to find each other. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "When I watched you at the sale that day," he said, "I knew something had happened. I did not know what exactly. I know what it was now. It was the first time in my adult life that I saw someone and thought that person understands what I understand and cares about what I care about and knows things I want to know more of." He stopped. "I'm not saying this as well as I want to." "You are saying it very well," she said quietly. "You changed everything," he said. "Not in the way that changes a thing from outside, in the way that finds the thing it was supposed to be all along." She reached across the table and put her hand over his and held it, and said nothing, because what he had said was complete and it did not need addition. Outside, the late summer night of the Texas hill country moved around the stone house, the creek running full, the horses settled in the pastures, the cedar and live oak doing what they had been doing for a long time before any of this, the stars where they always were in the enormous dark sky. Inside, 2 people sat in lamplight with their hands together on a table that held a paid receipt and 2 empty whiskey glasses, and the easy, particular quiet of 2 people who are exactly where they are supposed to be. The year 1888 brought a series of events that felt, looking back on them, like the final drawing together of things that had been working themselves out for a while. Elspeth Crawford, Alberta's sister, decided she was done with San Antonio and came north, not to live with Alberta and Ezekiel, which she made clear she would not do on the grounds that she was not built for living under anyone's roof including her sister's, but to rent a small house in Harlan's Creek itself, where she had decided to establish herself as the town's first female milliner, a venture that Ezekiel privately considered ambitious and Alberta privately considered inevitable. She was right. Within 6 months, Elspeth's hat shop was the social center of the town's female population, which meant it was actually the social center of the town, since women were doing most of the organized social work, and Elspeth had an ear for gossip and a tongue for news, and was in a perfect position to know everything that happened in Harlan's Creek within 48 hours of it happening. This was occasionally inconvenient for Alberta and Ezekiel's privacy, and routinely useful for everything else. It was through Elspeth that they heard, in the spring of 1888, that Franklin Garfield's operation to the south had finally reached the end of its overextended self. He had borrowed against the land 1 time too many, and the bank had called the note, and the Garfield spread was going to public sale in June. Ezekiel and Alberta talked about it for 3 evenings before they said anything out loud that constituted a decision, but the decision had been clear from the first conversation. The south pasture of the Garfield land bordered the Crawford property and included a spring-fed stock tank that had always been an asset in drought years. With the Dunlap land now fully merged in practical operation with the Crawford property, the addition of the Garfield South pasture would give them water security that the drought of 1886 had showed them they needed. They bought it in June, at a fair price because they were not the only bidders, but they were prepared and patient and knew exactly what they wanted. Alberta inspected the stock tank and its inflow before she raised her hand at the auction, which caused Ezekiel to look at her from across the sale ground with a smile he could not entirely contain. Afterward she found him and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "You checked it thoroughly before you bid." "I always do," she said, with a look that said she knew exactly what he was thinking and found it acceptable. He took her hand and they walked back to the wagon through the June heat, and James, who was 4 and had been sitting with Rosario's wife Esperanza in the wagon all morning with the patience of a child who knows that sitting still is the price of being allowed to come along, spotted them coming and stood up in the wagon bed, and waved with the full-body enthusiasm of a very small person reporting good news. The combined property now ran to a little over 800 acres, which was not a great estate, but was a genuinely solid ranch operation, and they spent the summer planning how to manage the new pasture and the tank and the integration of the additional fence lines, which gave them many good evenings of detailed discussion that both of them found satisfying in the particular way that planning shared work together is satisfying. That October, Alberta found she was expecting again. She told Ezekiel on a Sunday after church, in the wagon on the way home, sitting beside him on the seat with the reins in his hands and the hill country rolling around them in the sharp cool of fall, and he turned to look at her, and she was already watching him with those gray-green eyes that had not changed from the first day, and he said, "Again," in a voice that was trying to be calm. "Again," she said. He put the reins in one hand and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they rode the rest of the way home in the particular warmth of two people who have learned how to be close without any ceremony required. The third child came in June of 1889. Another boy, and they named him William Henry Dunlap. William for no particular family reason, but because both of them liked the sound of it, and Henry for a horse, which Alberta refused to confirm or deny, but which Ezekiel was privately certain about because there had been a horse on the property named Henry who had died of old age the previous winter, and whose quality Alberta had always considered exceptional. James, at 5, was solemn and proud about the new baby in a way that involved standing very close to the cradle and monitoring who came near, which Rosario said was exactly the behavior of a small ranch foreman, and Ezekiel said was his son through and through. Clara Rose, at 3, had opinions about William Henry that she expressed continuously, and that could be summarized as, he was acceptable, she was still in charge, and she required equal quantities of the attention that had been previously available in full to her. Alberta managed all of this with the calm patience she brought to horses and fence lines and school committees, and when Ezekiel came in from the evening's work and found her feeding William Henry in the lamplight with James asleep against her side, and Clara Rose constructing something complex out of wooden blocks on the floor, he stood in the doorway and thought that the specific quality of this, the lamplight and the sound of the evening ranch outside, and these three people in it, and the woman at the center of all of it, was the exact thing he had been working toward his whole life without having a name for it. She looked up and saw him standing there and said, "Are you going to come in or stand in the door?" He came in. He sat down beside her, and William Henry finished feeding, and he took the baby and held him against his shoulder with the practiced ease of a man who had done this twice already and found it no less moving for the repetition. And Alberta leaned her head against his shoulder, and he leaned his head against hers, and Clara Rose brought a wooden block over and placed it very specifically in his lap as though this were a gift of considerable importance. "Thank you," he said. "You may keep it," she said seriously. "I am grateful," he said. James stirred against Alberta's side and did not wake, and outside the creek ran with the good water of a spring that had been generous, and the horses were in the pasture, and the lamp burned down on the table, and that was all there was, and it was everything. By 1890, the Crawford Dunlap operation, it had become known by that combined name throughout the county, which had been Alberta's preference and Ezekiel's without any formal discussion, had become one of the more respected horse breeding programs in Central Texas. The reputation rested on the quality of the animals and specifically on the consistency of their soundness, which had become the operation's signature characteristic. Buyers knew that a Crawford Dunlap horse had been checked thoroughly, had been assessed by someone who knew what they were looking at, and arrived where it was going ready to work. Alberta's standard had become the operation's promise, and the operation's promise had kept its word. In the spring of 1890, a horseman came from Kentucky, a Mr. Alcott, representing a breeding establishment that supplied racehorses to the eastern tracts, and spent 4 days at the property examining the bloodlines and the breeding records, and talking to Alberta about foot structure and conformation with the absorbed, specific attention of a man who was hearing things he had been looking for. He made an offer for a breeding arrangement that would send 2 of their best mares east for 2 seasons and return them with foals from a thoroughbred stallion whose bloodline was well established. Alberta considered the offer for 3 days, which she spent reviewing everything Mr. Alcott had told her about the stallion's lineage and foot structure. She had asked for documentation on the feet specifically, which caused Mr. Alcott to blink once and then retrieve the documentation without comment. The structure was what she hoped. The offer was accepted. It was the beginning of what would become a new phase of the operation: better horses in the strictest sense, animals that combined the cattle-working intelligence and toughness of the quarter-horse bloodlines with the speed and refinement of the eastern thoroughbreds. And the foals that came back 2 years later were among the finest things either Alberta or Ezekiel had seen on their own property. And they knew it, and so did everyone else who saw them. The fall of 1890 brought one more thing worth noting. Horace Tibbs, who had told Ezekiel Alberta's name at the sale 8 years earlier, and who had been dining out on that story ever since at the Harlan's Creek Saloon where he was a regular fixture, finally cornered Ezekiel at the general store and said, "I want you to know I feel entitled to some credit for how this turned out." Ezekiel looked at him. "You told me her name," he said. "I did," Horace said. "I gave you everything you needed to get started." "I was going to find out her name anyway," Ezekiel said. "I was about 30 seconds from asking her myself." "But you asked me," Horace said. "That is the point. You asked me." Ezekiel thought about this for a moment. "Thank you, Horace," he said genuinely. "You are right. I asked you and you told me, and I am grateful." Horace Tibbs looked satisfied in the complete way of a man who had been waiting for this acknowledgment for a considerable time and was very glad to have it at last. Alberta, who had been in the dry goods section of the store and had heard this exchange while appearing to study bolts of fabric, came around the end of the shelf and said, "Mr. Tibbs, you have my gratitude as well." Horace nearly came out of his boots with pleasure. "Mrs. Dunlap," he said, "it was my honor entirely." She shook his hand and he went home that afternoon and told his wife the story again, in its fullest version from the beginning. And she listened to all of it because she was a good woman who had long since understood that Horace had exactly one great story, and it was a genuinely good one. The day that Alberta always said was the one she chose to remember, when she tried to put her whole life in a single image, was an October Sunday in 1891, when the children were 7, 5, and 2, and the hill country was doing the particular thing it did in October when the heat had broken, and the light came in at an angle that made everything look as though it had been recently clarified. She and Ezekiel had ridden out together in the early morning to check the fence line along the New South pasture, leaving the children with Esperanza Fuentes, who came over on Sundays for this purpose, and who the children loved with a completeness that was both gratifying and somewhat humbling. They rode side by side along the fence in the October morning, the grass rich and the stock tank gleaming through the trees and the horses moving well under them, and they were talking about the fence. Always the fence, always the horses, always the practical real things of their life. And then they were not talking, just riding in the comfortable silence that was one of the things she valued most about him. The way silence between them was never a gap but a fullness. She looked at him in the early morning light, his profile against the hill country sky, hat brimmed down, hands easy on the reins, the particular quiet of his face that had come to be the face she was most at home looking at in the world. And she thought about the livestock sale in 1882, and a bay mare with bad hooves and an unaddressed thrush problem, and a wooden box with a rasp, and the decision to check properly before she bid, as she always did, as her father had taught her. And the man on the fence rail who had seen. "You are thinking about something," he said without looking at her. "The sale," she said. He looked at her then. He knew immediately what she meant. The way you know immediately after enough years with someone what they mean by a single word that points at a whole world. I think about it too, he said. What do you think about, she asked. That I would have regretted it for the rest of my life if I had not asked Horace her name, he said. I was 30 seconds from asking you directly. I know, she said. How? Because of the way you were looking, she said. When I looked up from the hoof. You were not looking the way men usually look at a woman in a sale yard. You were looking the way you look at something that has surprised you with its quality. He was quiet for a moment. That is exactly right, he said. She looked forward between her horse's ears at the fence line and the October morning and the country that was theirs, both of theirs, hers and his, neither absorbing the other, side by side the way they were riding. I did not expect this, she said quietly. After Thomas died I thought the thing I was building here was going to be mine alone. I had made peace with that. I was genuinely at peace with it. And now, he said. She looked at him. Now I think the thing I was building was bigger than I could see, she said, and that the piece that was missing found its way here by knowing which horse to watch. He rode closer and reached over and she gave him her hand and he held it, and they rode with their hands joined in the October morning, the fence line running beside them, the stock tank catching the light, the hill country doing what it had always done and would do after them. And somewhere behind them in the stone house on the Salado Fork 3 children were probably making Esperanza's morning considerably more eventful than she had planned. And in the north pasture, the quarter thoroughbred crosses were working out what they were in the good grass, and somewhere in Kentucky a stud record was being maintained that would send more foals their way in the spring, and the Caldwell County School was operating with the extended hours and second teacher that Alberta had argued for over 3 years of committee meetings, and the water rotation agreement with the Marchetti family held, and the spring was running full, and the mortgage was paid, and the fence was sound. He let go of her hand and she let him, and they finished the fence check and turned back toward the house through the warming October day. And as they came over the last rise and the house came into view, she could see James in the yard with something that was probably a stick being applied to some purpose that Esperanza had certainly not authorized, and Clara Rose standing with her hands on her hips in a posture that was so completely Alberta's own posture that Ezekiel laughed out loud at the sight of it. What? Alberta said. Your daughter, he said. Look at how she is standing. Alberta looked at Clara Rose, hands on hips, face composed in the expression of a person who has assessed the situation and knows what to do about it. She felt the smile come to her face, full and warm, the smile she had given him for the first time on the day they met, and that she still had and would always have. She is going to be fine, Alberta said. She is going to be extraordinary, Ezekiel said. She is going to make some poor person very happy someday and also keep them thoroughly on their toes, Alberta said. Like her mother, Ezekiel said, looking at her. She looked back at him with those gray-green eyes that had assessed him at the sale yard 9 years ago and kept assessing him ever since, finding things worth knowing, finding things worth keeping. Like her mother, she agreed. They rode down the rise toward the house, toward the children and the sound of the morning and all the specific, ordinary, extraordinary particulars of the life they had built together. Hoof by hoof, fence post by fence post, season by season, and the October light lay over all of it like something given freely, and the creek ran beside the stone house on the Salado Fork, and everything that had needed to find its way home had found it, and it was good.